Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to re-review Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse. At the end of the day, I had reviewed this movie, and ultimately, I was kind of concerned that maybe this review was maybe too adult for YouTube, but then on top of that, I'm just deciding to re-review it because ultimately there was some imagery stuff, there was some all kinds of issues. So when looking at it, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna kind of cut my ties and otherwise just re-review this again and make a cleaner variation of this movie review. Ultimately, this time around, I hope to very much more go into much more detail about certain characters' names that I completely forgot about before. So when looking at this, hopefully people might like this review more or about the same. So hopefully, let's get into talking about this movie in a very cryptic-like sense, eventually going into a double five spoiler-like time, and then going into spoilers about this movie. So, in a cryptic-like sense, this movie really, I would very much call this an ensemble piece. Because I don't think really if it was a movie just about Ben, Augie, and Carter, the three Boy Scouts, I think, and them just consistently fighting zombies for an hour and 45 some odd minutes for a bulk of this movie, I just don't think that like a lot of people would enjoy this movie that much. So, but going into this movie, like it does take an entire cast to make this movie really fun. There's a lot of much more experienced actors that are having fun in this movie, and that's what I think I like most about it. When this movie goes off as a coming of age story where there's guys that are otherwise trying to um, change to be different people, so that way they think that they can be much more appealing to the opposite gender. And also, reasonably, when looking at this movie, you're having a lot of you're having kids that I think have been like good, decent kids for a bulk of their life, and now they just want to really just finally get into some trouble. They really want to finally just do something different, and instead of just being the goody two shoes people that they've been for so long. Because ultimately, they think if they can become a bad boy, then ultimately that would lend them to finally being a person that a woman would want to be with or ultimately want to kiss. When going into this movie, when looking at it, I think the best part about this movie is that Ben, Carter, and Augie are the people, or the perfect people for this job to take out these zombies, because they are very much the Taken persona of this movie. They've had a long, longevous amount of random skills that will eventually come into tying into perfection within this review, or within this movie, I should say. And everybody else is just like, I don't know any better. And so when Ben, Carter, and Augie are just like easily thinking of a way to take down a zombie, and all they have left is a mop in front of them, like baby, basically they can figure out a way to take down a zombie with pretty much anything, as long as it comes down to them having the right things. Like they just have the right enough equipment enough with them, which is basically to the point of almost nothing at some point. They almost kind of become the MacGyvers of this movie, to figure out how to be able to do things without the equivalent of desperately needing a gun or a sword or any number of anything that The Walking Dead would tend to use from time to time. So, going into this movie, if you do not know, this is a raunchy, and I mean raunchy, a raunchy adult gore zombie movie. So at the end of the day, if that doesn't in some way, if any of the words that I just said appeal to you, then maybe you might not like this film. Uh, Reasonably within this review, I find this movie every time I watch it, I find it to be fun. Even if after watching it the first time around, it after a while starts to become like a kind of paint by numbers kind of movie because ultimately um, you kind of know where they're going after a while. There's like there's some zombie-ish like movies that are way too complicated that you can never remember what happens. Like they're way too just over the top and you're just like I don't remember this movie at all. Um, I think when going into Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, I think probably it's good to not be too all over the place, but it is also like pretty good um, to ultimately almost make a drinking game out of some zombie movies. Because again, this is kind of a coming of age story where ultimately a lot of guys are otherwise thinking about um, getting a beer or two. So going into this movie's fun. It's really like you can tell a lot of the characters were like, especially a lot of the more experienced actors. I'm sure were probably very much having fun with these roles. Uh, you can kind of tell that reasonably. Um, some of the roles that were presented, like especially the you could buy the all every single one of the Boy Scouts doing what they're doing. Uh you could actually buy Ben as being like the leader esh like character out of these three people. Where when looking at him at in X-Men, you couldn't buy him as being the leader of the X-Men. You couldn't buy it at all. But in this movie you could buy Ben being a leader. So yeah, reasonably, it kind of a little bit does make fun of Boy Scouts. It kind of does make it in a way of which that kids are making fun of Boy Scouts in this movie, but the triumphant thing of them is that hey, these people all hated on these three guys, but when looking at it, they saved their lives. They saved their lives. They ultimately could figure a way out for them to live. Um, so yeah, if anything, it's kind of like one of those stories where it's like, hey, yeah, hate on the nerd, but the nerd is gonna save your life one day, and so because he knows something that you don't. I think is the real true thing about this movie. So hopefully there's a lot of goofy or nerdy kids that ultimately got a good fun thing out of this movie at the end of the day. So, anyways, that's I think all I want to say for the very cryptic like variation of this. I want to go into spoilers, and I apologize for how long 8 minutes and some odd minutes that took. So, let's go into spoilers about this movie at the end of the day. I hope I get everything correct because ultimately, let's get into this. So, let's go into the double five time territory. Going a little bit faster about all this because normally I don't want there to be too much of a waste of time. Spoiler time! It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, we ultimately open with this movie with Ron the janitor, who is ultimately in a very much Star Lord like way, very much having his head bopping to some pretty dang good music, ultimately dancing around in this facility. This facility that is evidently with doctors and or scientists. So ultimately, if I get this incorrect, because I'm assuming this is a doctor, I could be wrong. So ultimately, Ron, Blake Anderson, which a lot of people might know from Workaholics, or ultimately may know him as any number of different characters or a number of different shows. Yeah, but mostly Workaholics. I enjoyed Workaholics. I saw it every once in a while. So, Ron, the janitor, like Anderson, ultimately going and dancing around into the facility, ultimately realizing that there is some doctor still hard at work at finding some cure of whatever the heck that he's doing, because whatever the heck he's doing, Ron eventually will probably figure out what it is. So we end up having Ron approaching this doctor and ultimately mentioning, "Hey, I'm going to be cleaning up here pretty soon. Like, do you um, like how long are you going to be?" And ultimately, the doctor goes, "Okay, well, I'm just gonna go and leave and get some vending machine food." And then ultimately he'll come back. So while the doctor is leaving, Ron is cleaning up. Maybe a little bit too well. Maybe a little bit too much Ron. So Ron ultimately is cleaning up, and he's cleaning up next to a patient that is in a medical bed. And ultimately, while Ron is cleaning up, he bumps into one of the medical equipment that is ultimately keeping said seemingly a live-esh like person alive. And so Ron keeps trying to hit the reset button, trying to get this life support thing to work, and it does not work. So Ron does the second best thing, or the second dumbest thing, and he jumps onto the body and tries to perform CPR. The only problem is he doesn't really want to perform CPR, because here's the thing. Ultimately, we have Ron pumping away at this guy's chest, trying to do CPR, but then eventually he also needs to perform mouth to mouth, because CPR. Ultimately, he is throwing all kinds of Tic Tacs in this guy's mouth, and then he's just blowing air into this guy's mouth, because he's not going to actually mouth to no. Ultimately, Ron is pressing so hard on this guy's chest that his hands fall through this guy's chest, and then eventually said patient, said person, wakes up and starts attacking Ron the janitor. We ultimately see that the doctor is still crazily taking the longest time to get a bag of chips out of a vending machine, because this vending machine does not want to work. And so he's getting his treat from a vending machine while Ron is dying, seemingly, by being attacked um, by a zombie. He is pressed against this glass going, "Help me," kind of thing, and then he falls to the ground. Ultimately, the doctor ultimately finally gets his treat, and ultimately it seems that Ron is um, walking out of said portion of which where the doctor was, to go and greet him. And ultimately, so the doctor turns to a zombie-fied Ron, who is going to get a little nibble, getting a little jibble, getting a little bite of delight from said doctor. So ultimately, that transitions us into us seeing a brochure, if you will, or an advertisement, if you will, a promo-like video of all three Boy Scouts and their scout leader, David Koshner. Koshner. I ultimately remember him from the comebacks, and ultimately he's done a lot of different kind of movies. He's been in the movie Waiting and a bunch of other stuff. He was in Krampus as well, which I've seen him in that. It's pretty funny. Their scout leader. They are doing this advertisement about Boy Scouts and how fun it is. And recently we have a bunch of people doing these camera shots about how supposedly fun they're having. It gets to the point where at the very end of the video, they're all jumping in the air bizarrely, saying, "Yeah, Boy Scouts are fun!" And it's weird. Ultimately, we are now showcasing this advertisement to any boy who is willing to be recruited and wants to be in the Boy Scouts. and there's seemingly only one guy that showed up to think about applying for Boy Scouts, but immediately after this advertisement, he eventually just starts walking out and leaves. To where Ben, Carter, and Aki are like realizing how like really difficult it is to get one person for Boy Scouts because nobody wants to show up. Their scout leader is just like, well, hey, come on, like I'm sure we'll get somebody. It's like, if anything, like, yeah, we took all these hours of work, but man, it was so worth it because if anything, this scout leader is very optimistic. So ultimately, what is going to happen is we find out that Augie is going to get this new, I think, badge um, for Boy Scouts, and so ultimately they are going to have a camp out to celebrate it. And so reasonably, like Ben is kind of congratulating Augie on getting his new badge or getting his new reward, and so ultimately we have them all leave, and Ben and Carter are both in their own vehicle, um, kind of just talking about how they are kind of like, especially Carter, but Ben is kind of like 50-50 about it. Carter is mentioning how ultimately he wants to tell Augie that both him and Ben want to get out of Scouts because ultimately he finally wants them to stop doing Boy Scouts because ultimately, like, for their junior year, like, he thinks if they are still Boy Scouts by their junior year um, that women won't want them anymore, or women won't want them, and it'll just be like, oh man, hey, we missed out. Um, Ben is kind of wishy washy about this, and ultimately he's just kind of like, well, like, we shouldn't tell him now. If anything, um, like Augie's getting his badge tonight, so maybe we'll tell him later. Like, it just seems like Ben is kind of really delaying and delaying and delaying, to the point to where I think that they're just gonna like always just be in Scouts, just because reasonably, like, Ben doesn't want to, like, Ben is between like two friends and he doesn't know like who to say yes or no to. So it ends up that while Ben and Carter are really into this conversation, they end up hitting a deer. And so ultimately they get into a car accident, and ultimately they're just like, oh crap, what do we do? And so immediately, luckily enough, Carter ends up seeing a car drive up, and luckily enough, it is actually his sister's car, ultimately Kendall. So ultimately, Carter flags Kendall down, and he is mentioning like, "Hey, like, we're into some car trouble. Do you think any of you could fix it?" And so immediately, Kendall goes to Ben at some point, and ultimately mentions is like, "Wow, like, it seems like the deer got off a lot better than you guys did." And like Ben's like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "Yeah, the deer is already gone." And so it's like, okay, yeah, that's a little weird. Um, so immediately, Carter is talking to Kendall's friend, and is ultimately just kind of hitting on her, and ultimately just kind of like trying to see if they can go on a date or anything together. And ultimately, Kendall's friend is ultimately, as well as I think his name is Jeff, Kendall's quasi maybe boyfriend, is kind of telling them about this party to go to that is for seniors, but ultimately they're going to ask them to come too. And so immediately Carter is psyched because he's like, oh my god, yeah, I just talked these people into having me come to this party. This seems great. Ultimately, it's like, hey, text me for the address and this and that. So we have Kendall and them uh, stick around for a little bit, and Carter and Ben. Carter mentions to Ben, it's like, hey, like we're gonna go to this party, and Ben mentions like, well, what about Augie's like ceremony and camping? And ultimately, Carter goes, man, we're gonna ditch Augie and go to this party, and then we're gonna come back. So that is their master plan. So when ultimately thinking about prepping for this party, Ben and Carter are at this like gas station, and so ultimately Carter's plan is to ultimately find somebody to get them beer. Ultimately, he goes to some hobo-esh like guy that doesn't know his head from a hole in the ground, and then Carter mentions while the hobo-ish looking guy is getting beer, Carter mentions about the adult club that is next door, and and basically he also notices um, this girl named Denise that is ultimately supposedly a girl that works there, but we'll ultimately find out later that she is just a waitress there, or a bartender. Um, Denise. So we have Carter that is looking at this hobo-ish character that is just walking around this store, and like Carter's like, no, what is he doing? So eventually Carter goes into this store and is trying to get this guy to buy them what he said to buy them. And we have Denise walk up and drop everything out of her purse. Ben is the nice guy. He goes and tries to recollect all the stuff into her purse. Ultimately, Dennis or ultimately Ben mentions that like, oh, I see that you work at the adult that you work at the club next door, and she's like, yeah, I work there, and yeah. And he's like, well, yeah, I've never been in there, but I've heard good reviews on Yelp. And she's like, God, you're kind of funny. And so immediately, since this girl got helped by Ben with her purse, basically she's looking at Carter trying to see this guy um, buy them to beer, and she's ultimately asking like, well, hey, what is Carter the idiot doing in there? And he tells him, it's like, well, yeah, try to get this guy to buy him beer, but nothing's happening, it looks like. So Denise goes in there, gets two things of beer, and walks up to the counter, grabs the money from the homeless man and buys the beer, and then eventually gives it to Carter and Ben because, of course, Ben was nice to Denise, so in kind she bought them beer. Ultimately, yeah, she told him like, hey, yeah, you should have a more responsible person do this for you. But yeah, Denise is really nice. I like Denise. She's really great. And plus, once you see her more in this movie, man, is she really great. She's a really like badass character. So, anyways, we ultimately, where is the scout leader? Is where kind of this journey kind of goes into. We ultimately have the scout leader that is kind of doing a walkabout that is ultimately just kind of out in the forest. And while he's just kind of walking around, I think preparing for the camping scenario that's going to be happening a little bit later on. Ultimately, he's walking around this forest and ultimately notices that there's some badge laying around of some doctor. He's ultimately like, hey, why did this get all the way out here? And so immediately, like, the scout leaders continue to walk around. All of a sudden, a rush of brush goes into him, and it's all of a sudden a crazed deer, to the point where ultimately we have it to where the scout leader stabs this deer in the eye, and then ultimately the deer drops. And the scout leader's like, yeah, that's what happens when you mess with me. And then eventually, right after that, we find out where the doctor had been missing his badge. We find out that this doctor comes up behind the scout leader, and it is a zombie, and takes him and turns the scout leader into a zombie. So we have it to where Augie, Carter, and Ben are at this camp out, and so ultimately we they're just kind of they're at this camp and they're kind of waiting for their scout leader. They're like, okay, when is he gonna come? Like ultimately he's supposed to give Augie this badge. Like what's going on? So eventually, of course, like we have Carter that is trying to use his cell phone, and they don't really have much service out there, and so Ben, Augie, and Carter are just kind of like waiting for their scout leader that seems to never have come, and so what happens is that they wait for so long that they all end up going to sleep in their tents. Well, not all of them. We ultimately have it to where Ben and Carter start to sneak away. And once they start to sneak away, and like Ben is kind of mentioning to Carter that Augie might wake up, and Carter is just like, no, I'm sure he'll be able to sleep through anything, because Ben is consistently getting worried about Augie finding out or anything. So eventually we have Augie that is right behind Ben and Carter. And they ultimately just tell him the truth that they were going to leave him to ultimately go to this party. And Augie was like, well, hey, why not bring me along too? And they're just like, so Augie and Carter and Ben they end up going their separate ways because of just being too indifferent, and plus really Augie realizes when he's not needed, so he just leaves to ultimately just go to the scout leader's home, um, because ultimately the boys are probably thinking that he's sick, or that ultimately he's just at his home listening to Dolly Parton all the day long, because I guess his house is full of Dolly Parton-ish like memorabilia, which is weird. Anyways, so what ends up happening is we are seeing Ben and Carter back again at this same gas station, and they're starting to realize how deserted everywhere is. And Ben mentions, it's like, well, hey, why is this place so deserted on a Friday night? This makes no sense. And so immediately we have it to where they're just kind of looking around and everything's deserted, but eventually Carter notices right away there is no bouncer in front of the gentleman's club. So ultimately Carter runs over to the club, and ultimately Ben, of course, forcibly follows because he's like, I don't know about this. Like, dude, are we gonna get thrown out of here? And but then again, ultimately, Ben is like really mentioning how deserted seemingly everywhere is. It makes no sense. So the two both go into this club, and immediately Carter is running to go to the ATM to get dollar bills, and Ben is just ultimately just looking around, going like very concerned again about how there's nobody in this club. And so he sits down next to the, let's just say, a place nearby a pole, and ultimately a woman comes walking from out the back to, let's just say, do a performance of sorts. So ultimately, Ben is mentioning to this performer that his friend is getting the money, like wait for it, like he'll be here, and then Carter is running to throw this woman, of course, dinero, dollar bills, money. And but then Ben is starting to realize and started to notice how very much different this woman looks. And ultimately he's like, you know what, there's something not right about this woman. And Carter is mentioning like, well, it's probably just makeup, it's probably just whatever. And Ben's like, you know what, I'm not quite sure. And ultimately this performer does one act where she all of a sudden is losing her neck, to where her neck detaches from the rest of her body. And then they're like, oh, yeah. Carter's like, yeah, I get what you're saying now. I get it. And so immediately when that happens, we have it um, to where the bouncer, we find out, is an actual zombie. And so immediately we have it to where Ben is running from the bouncer and Carter is running behind the bar, because why wouldn't he? So Ben is running into the bathroom stall, and he is putting his feet on top of a toilet seat, thinking that a a zombie bouncer isn't going to see him in the bathroom if he can't see his feet, which is stupid. So reasonably, what ends up happening is that ultimately we have it to where Carter is at the bar, and he is very much kind of like looking around, kind of poking his head out, to where he's ultimately attacked by this performer, let's just say. And so eventually this performer grabs him. He ultimately takes a broken bottle and stabs her into the head. The top of the bottle comes flying out with blood, and ultimately um, we get it to where Denise starts to show upon herself and starts shooting these people that are zombies. She starts shooting them down, and ultimately that's how we kind of victory our way through this. So ultimately we have it to where Ben, Denise, and Carter are getting out of this club, and ultimately they are getting into their car, but then they realize that they have a flat tire. They are crazily trying to change this tire, all while there's a huge swarm of zombies right by their car. Denise is shotgunning her way through as many zombies as she can, but then eventually she is smacking the zombies with her shotgun because she's running out of bullets. Eventually, they change the tire. Eventually, they get into the car and drive away. Ultimately, they have it to where Augie goes all the way to the house of said um, scout leader, and ultimately using his bathroom because of the beans or some of the stuff that they ate. Uh, at one point, Augie, when they were at the campsite, he ultimately had gotten a marshmallow stuck to his head, and Carter had made a photo of that, and it was kind of funny. Um, but ultimately, yeah, like they had eaten all kind of beans and all kinds of other kind of foods that would probably mess up their stomach a lot. So Augie goes and uses the scout leader's bathroom. Ultimately, has to open a window. A zombie was almost seemingly going to crawl through the window, but never does. So Augie eventually goes and leaves a note for the scout leader that it's like, hey, yeah, hey, um, hope that you're okay. Like I was here just to let you know, Augie. And so he leaves the note, but then eventually he finds said scout leader, and this scout leader is zombified, but Augie doesn't know any better. Um, he just assumes that at first point that their scout leader is just sick, and so the scout leader is making kind of noises, and so Augie is mentioning it's like, oh yeah, like I'm sorry, I used your toilet, and man, the smell in there, I'm sorry, it must have been the beans or something. And the scout leader was like, and he's like, yeah, I know it smells really bad in there. I do apologize. I tried to use a spray or something, but man, sorry. So it just gets to a point to where eventually uh, we have it to where the zombie tries to attack tries the scout leader, who is a zombie, tries to attack Augie, and ultimately Augie smashes a Dolly Parton head statue on top of the scout leader, and ultimately what ends up happening is um, tries to take him down, but ultimately just ends up with him. Uh, Tying him up onto this chair, um, and then like putting his toupee back onto his head. So we have our other characters ultimately all re-finding one another again, because ultimately at the end of all this, um, we have it to where Ben and Carter and Augie are all and Denise are all reconnecting together at some point. Um, because ultimately what happens is that they all head back to, I think, the scout leader's house, and then eventually um, they transition to drive out to this. They ultimately walk all out to find a another vehicle, um, because what ends up happening is, wait a minute, wait a minute for a second. Um, yeah. So Ben, Carter, Denise. Here's what happens. I'm like, how do they all get back together? Here's how. So Augie was at Augie was at the scout leader's home. Ben, Carter, and Denise all end up going from their car to the police station. There we go. I'm like, how did this happen? Here's how it happens. It just took me a second to remember. Um, they go to the police station. Ben Denise, Carter go to the police station, and ultimately the police station has a note saying that the last evacuation, like bus or train or bus or whatever transport, had left, and ultimately they were told to go to some address to have a roadblock there, so they can kind of get through this roadblock. So they end up going through this police station anyways, and it very much ends up that they, because ultimately they're kind of forced to, because zombies are starting to form in front of this police station. So they head inside, and while these zombies are continually trying to get through into this police station, Denise, Carter, and Ben all walk into a sheriff that is also a zombie that is holding a gun that is just kind of shooting around. So they take down this sheriff zombie, I think, with a like an American flag. They just kind of poke him with a flagpole and kill him. And so eventually, while these zombies are still making their way through this police station, they are running into the prison cell. And so ultimately, they are in prison, and ultimately, what is happening is that Ben is whittling a mop that he found and is whittling it into a spear to ultimately stab the zombies, because that's the only weapon that they seem to have. So we have it to where Carter is consistently trying as much as possible to figure out what can be his best profile pic. So he's going right next to zombies and taking photos, because every single time he is making photos, he's trying to come up with a really great profile pic for his whatever social media. So we have it to where ultimately Denise is kind of looking at Ben, and she's impressed that he's like whittling this mop, and she's like, man, like you must be really good at like whittling. And he's like, yeah, I've had a very long stretch of experience. Like, it's a good thing it comes in handy right now. So eventually we have it to where Augie is somewhere near the police station, playing music really loud in one of the cars, and immediately Ben and Carter realize this because it's Soldier Boy and it's Carter's favorite song. So we have it to where all the zombies are heading out of the station, and it seems like Augie's kind of trying to make his way back into the station. And so when Ben, Carter, and Denise realize that all the people are gone, Ben takes and realizes that like they need to get to the key to this cell. So what happens is that Ben asks for the, let's just say, rubber that Carter has in his pockets from when he thinks he's going to get lucky tonight, if you know what I mean. He gives him all these rubbers, and so Ben goes and ties this all to this mop, and then concocts this contraption to ultimately try to get this key off of this part of this room. And does so, but the only problem is when they try to get it, Augie comes in, it scares them, and ultimately they drop the key somewhere to where Augie can't get it. But Augie eventually has this like Swiss Army knife that eventually can unlock this door bizarrely anyways. So recently, because Augie thought that they had gotten arrested, it's like, no, like if anything we had to, like we were stuck in here. So eventually, like again, they're realizing how useful Augie is, because eventually he can pick this lock of this prison cell and get them out. So ultimately what ends up happening is that they just start as quickly as possible running out of this prison because they realize that zombies are starting to come back into this prison. They start running out of the prison, and immediately they try to close this fence, but one of the zombies gets stuck in between getting to them and being stuck in the fence. And this is, of course, the one of the police officers that ultimately Carter had mentioned earlier when he was at the gas station, how attractive she was. And so this woman later on is now stuck in this fence, and ultimately her shirt rips, and you can pretty much see the top half of her entire body, because ultimately she evidently doesn't wear anything underneath her officer's uniform, evidently. So Carter gets some good touch in time, and then he runs away, telling Ben how those didn't exactly feel real, if you know what I mean. And so we have all of these guys now together. I apologize for that mistake. And they are just kind of walking, continually to walk to just find the next car. Immediately, they end up finding a zombie in between a car. And so ultimately, they're looking at the zombie, and they are trying to figure out how tactically they can figure out how to sway this zombie to ultimately just kind of run off. They're trying to establish dominance. They're trying to scare it. They're trying to ultimately sing Britney Spears to it in a very weird, bizarre-like way. And then we have some random commando that ends up shooting said zombie in the head. So we ultimately have it to where we are starting to find out that this commando was the only guy left out of everybody, and that it seems like they are going to be like they're just kind of getting who's ever left to rescue. Because ultimately, we find out via some walkie that it's going to be 2 hours before they end up like detonating this whole city. Because supposedly, I guess everyone had been considered evacuated. So ultimately, we have it to where Ben and Carter are mentioning to this military official, it's like, well, hey, well, did you find the kids from this private party? And ultimately, he's like, what are you talking about? And they're like, oh yeah, they probably don't even know this is going on, that this is even a thing. Oh crap. So excuse me. So immediately we have it to where these guys are going to this location of this party, and ultimately to rescue all these people. And what ends up happening is they end up going out of the Humvee, with the exception of Denise with this military-ash like guy, and they realized that the location was not the right location, that they were lied to, that they were given a false location, because ultimately Kendall is asking at this party that they are at, where is her brother? And Jeff ultimately says, like, dude, do you really think that I would have them come to this party with us? Like, no, they're Boy Scouts. Like, no, there's no way we would have them come to the party because they're losers and this and that. So while Kendall is unaware of some of the extracurricular activities that some of her other party goers are going into, ultimately we have one girl who is off to the side, just otherwise thinking about doing some adult content with some boy. But that said boy is ultimately going to start something that he just can't quite finish. Because ultimately, this girl mentions, hey, how about you can do this to me? And so ultimately he goes, okay, great. She starts laying down somewhere. Ultimately, the most hardest, heaviest volume that she can is watching some reality show while he's doing whatever he's going to be doing. And supposedly, we have a zombie without a jaw uh, coming into frame to attack this boy. And at the perfect time this boy is screaming, so is the screaming going on this girl's reality show phone thing going on here. So she doesn't hear anything. Stupidly. So ultimately, we have Zombie, who is now going to uh, do some adult content, and eventually the girl is realizing how cold this zombie's tongue is, and so eventually this zombie gets a little bit more than what you would think, and so ultimately this girl eventually goes out to the dance floor and eventually gets to the point of starting to, let's just say, attack people. So we're starting to full force start to see some partying, much more than just dubstep going on in this party. So everybody is just like, this sucks. So we have to where transition into the boys back at this false location. And so ultimately, Carter comes up with this master plan. Ultimately, he is thinking that it's like, well, hey, if Kendall is going to this party, ultimately she will have written the location of this party in her diary because she writes everything in her diary. So Ben and Augie and everybody's like, hey, yeah, that's a good plan. We need to get to your house then. So we have Denise looking at this zombie guy, asking him or ultimately this soldier guy, and asking him a question. And this soldier guy is now a zombie guy. Kind of gave that away a little bit, but anyways. So zombie guy ends up attacking her, and eventually, who would you think? The zombie guy ends up dying. The soldier guy ends up getting killed. Willy-nilly, of course, because reasonably, Denise gets out of the Humvee. The zombie comes closer to the door, and Denise crushes this guy's head with the Humvee door. Really angry about having to kill all these zombies and be attacked by zombies for this entire night. So they all drive off to go into Carter's home. Of course, they're not alone, because why would they be? Slowly but surely, while they are starting to realize that they are trying to get into this girl's room and otherwise try to get to this diary, slowly but surely, we are every once in a while within around this house starting to see zombies slowly but surely come in here. There is at one point one zombie consistently jumping on this trampoline. There's some other zombies slowly but surely come to this house. We ultimately have the scout leader and Miss Felder. That is kind of like one of the neighbor, the old lady neighborish like woman that comes in to attack Carter, attacks Carter's backside bizarrely, which is weird. So ultimately, we have it to where Augie and Carter are ending up having to fight off these zombies downstairs, and ultimately, they eventually rush into Kendall's room and are now trying as desperately as possible to find out where the heck this this book is. Ultimately, we have it to where Ben is looking into Kendall's ladies' garments drawer of her dresser, and he's like, the promised land, bizarrely. But anyways, he doesn't take anything. So while Augie and Carter are downstairs before all these zombies rush in, we have it to where Dennis and Ben um, are talking to one another, and they're having this nice little moment where Tyler is just kind of like, you know what, like I don't think, because ultimately, like when they're at that point of at that false location, everybody starts confessing things. Ultimately, Carter confesses, or ultimately, Augie confesses that Ben is in love with Carter's sister, and ultimately, Carter doesn't like that. And but it's like, well, yeah, but it's not my sister. Ben ultimately says, and so like they're confessing how like since Augie was treated like crap, ultimately he's getting back at everybody else by telling them all the truth. And so now when Dennis and Ben are in this room alone, ultimately Denise is asking him about Kendall. It's like, hey, are you gonna ask this girl out once you rescue her? And ultimately he's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't think I'm the right guy for her because I've never really kissed anyone. And so Denise helps him out with that, and ultimately like go like, well, it shouldn't be that bad. If anything, you wanna try. Like, I know you were checking me out before, so ultimately, how about we kiss? So ultimately they bump heads, but then eventually they kiss, and ultimately she says it's not that bad, and he's ultimately like, really? And she's like, yeah, it didn't crack the top five their guy, but you did okay. So ultimately she's telling her, it's like, well, yeah, when you finally see her, you should plant one on her, and maybe that'll cement this relationship. So Augie and Carter are getting butt attacked, and so they make their way up to this room. Zombies are starting to swarm into this house like crazy, and it gets to the point to where they realize that there are zombies around the trampoline, and one zombie is on the trampoline. Or at one point, one zombie was. Because eventually they bounce a zombie off. So their plan of attack is to jump off of said Kendall's window onto this trampoline onto this fence to climb over and ultimately evade all these zombies. We have it to where when Augie goes out, he has to um, basically shimmy a zombie off of the trampoline and make it so he falls off, and then Augie jumps over. It goes well for Carter, goes well for Denise. Augie has some issues, and then ultimately, while finding Denise's diary and taking too long, Ben is up, but eventually Ben ends up getting stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so there are too many zombies on the trampoline, and there are ultimately too many um, zombies inside the house, so there's nowhere for him to go. Eventually, Denise jumps back over the fence to get the zombies to get away from the trampoline. And then so Ben falls on the trampoline, gets over the fence, hopping over all the zombies. And I'm not going to say why Ben was holding on to something, and then eventually he flings it away because adult content. So we have it to where, because I can't explain it. I just can't. There's an old man who has lost some twig and berries, let's just say, at the end of the day. So I guess that's all I can say. Legitimately, this time around. So he's a elderly zombie, I guess. So, anyways, now these people have read the diary, know the location that they are going because they could read zombies. They read the diary, they know the address that they're going to, but before they go in there, they are going to come in there prepared. And they're going to try to modify some certain lawn equipment and potato guns and stuff like that to go up against zombies, because they figure that more than likely there's probably going to be a ton of zombies because there's going to be a ton of people at this party. So zombies are going to slowly but surely make their way to this party. So, and they're pretty much right. So we have it to where they modify all these weapons and they have to kind of like slowly but surely kind of showcase how cool they look while wielding them. And so then immediately they all go to this party, and of course, this party is starting to run rampant with zombies. And so immediately we have it to where all three of the boys are all potato gunning or weed blade whacking their way through a boatload of these zombies, and it really becomes a really cool kind of showcasing where I think Augie, or no, wait, one of them has like a potato gun that ends up getting like shot out of like something ends up getting shot out of this potato gun like a cannon, and it ends up ripping through one zombie's head to go into another zombie's head, and so on. And it looked really cool. Ultimately, you have it to where at some point the lawn equipment that they all had, or all the equipment that they're using to attack all these zombies, at some point eventually starts to run out. So they try to save as many people as they can, and then they ultimately try to concoct this explosive to take all the other zombies out. And before the explosive goes off, they're going to go and slide down this bizarrish, like, chute thing to get them out of this building. So, because we have Augie that invents this bomb for them to use, because ultimately he had been planning, he had figured out how to use this bomb, because ultimately it's a very unique skill that I think his father told him. Because ultimately Ben and Augie have this nice moment where Ben asks him about his father, and like it kind of becomes a really nice and sweet moment. So we have it to where saving all these kids from the zombie ash-like apocalypse, then throwing out this bomb in there, and like reasonably it gets to the point to where like they don't know how like long the fuse is, they don't know how, like, if it's going to work out so well. So eventually they all go eventually sliding down this little tunnel ash like thing, this little like playhouse like slide thing, and then the party place that they were at explodes. So basically they think everything is great, everything is copacetic. Like at some point we remember that Augie had lit the scout leader on fire and ultimately tried to take him down via that. And so ultimately when they are thrusted into, okay, they're kind of out of weapons, and immediately they are realizing that there's yet one more zombie that is I think the scout leader that comes back. They're just like, oh my god, like we have no weapons and we're all out of everything. It's like, come on, like somebody could somebody take this thing down? And so it ends up being put down, and basically we eventually find out that uh, that military forces are coming in and everything is copacetic. And because ultimately Ben had on the walkie tried to prevent this strike to come in through the town, and no one had heard him. It's like he couldn't get a word in edgewise. So, but evidently the military comes into play now, and so ultimately everybody's like, huzzah, like, hey, our town is saved. And so it gets to the point where towards the end of this movie, we have to where seemingly um, like Ben and Carter and Augie they're all good. Um, seems like Denise is kind of um, off to very much be like happy about this, like all just kind of being resolved. And so really there's not like, you would think that Ben would end up with Denise at the end of all this, and like I think that's how the movie should have ended. I don't care how much older Denise is. I don't care. I think that's what the relationship should have been at the end of this movie. So the very last thing is Ben instead goes to Kendall and locks a big lip on her and kisses her, and that's just kind of the send off of this whole movie. So at the end of the day, that's all I want to say about the movie. I think towards the very tail end there, like the details started to get very vague or very foggy, and I apologize. But otherwise, I'm going to get out of here. This is an hour and 5 minutes. I don't remember how long the review ultimately took originally, but hour and 5 minutes, so I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.